Glenn Carle is an American writer and former intelligence officer. He's the author of The Interrogator and Education 2011, which describes his involvement in the interrogation of a man at the time believed to be one of the top members of al-Qaeda. John's Hopkins Magazine found that The Interrogator to be unusually candid in its portrayal of the CIA's internal workings and the toll that the agency's moral grey zones take on its operatives. Well, we're going to touch upon some of these themes today, as well as ideas of state capture and how Russian active measures works. Glenn spent 20 years in clandestine field operations within the Central Intelligence Agency, and he retired as Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Transnational Threats from the National Intelligence Council. Carl has been highly critical of President Donald Trump, particularly after Trump began to disparage American intelligence agencies' assessment of Russian influence over the 2016 presidential election. We are, of course, going to touch on that as well. He told Newsweek in an article dated December 21st, 2017, that he believed that President Donald Trump was actually working directly for the Russians. Among other roles, Glenn is a columnist for Newsweek Japan, providing commentary and analysis of international relations, geostrategic and US political issues, and foreign policy and intelligence issues. Before we jump in, I want to say a huge thank you to everybody who supports the channel, who helps make this happen. It's not easy getting an episode out a day. Plus all the live events we've been putting on in Ukraine and other places. So everyone who supported the channel by watching the material and also becoming a patron or buying me a coffee, you helped make this happen, and it is incredibly important. Glenn, thank you so much for coming on the channel.
Thank you for having me. I'm honored.
Let's start with Russia. That may not have been your primary focus throughout your career, but you must have a fairly clear idea of what kind of an entity Russia is, what kind of a murderous regime it is ruled by, and what kind of a threat it poses to the so-called Western bloc of democracies.
Yes, well, I started my career in the early mid 1980s, and it's a world that shockingly people don't even recall now, unless you have gray hair like mine, just about, which is the Cold War, and the world was divided in two. There's the Soviet Union and the United States, or the West. And so the focus of the CIA, our number one priority, it's called an operational directive. Those are the ranking of our tasks, what we were supposed to work on. Always had, of course, the Soviet Union and communism as the number one target in our terminology and issue. So even though I was not a Soviet specialist. I don't speak Russian or Slavic language, and wasn't in I'll call it the Soviet division. Everybody worked on the Cold War, and I had any number of times, and I'll have to be a little fuzzy, direct work on Russian and Soviet issues.
You must be looking with some alarm then at the efforts to not only deprioritize Russia as a threat, as has happened under President Trump. That already started, I think, under Biden and previous administrations, where China started to be seen as the number one threat. But you must also, have some, let's say, concerns about the removal or evisceration of various organizations, looking at the influence of Russian oligarchs and their money, looking at election interference, and of course, the deconstruction of those organizations charged with looking out for Russian cyber threats and informational penetration of our media. All this seems to have been deconstructed. I mean, are you concerned? It's a bit silly question. Are you concerned about that? But also, do you see this as intentionally creating space for Russian aggression, or is it just part of an incidental deconstruction of governance in general within the US?
Well, I certainly agree with the overall strategic shift of the United States over a period of 25, 35 years, really 25 to 30 years, from having the Soviet Union as the number one priority to having China, and that's all the data shows that really there's only one peer competitor of the United States, and that is China. And peer competitor may be praising the United States more than it deserves at this point, depending on the issue. So strategically, in the macro sense, that is all sensible, and I agree with those changes. In fact, the United States was trying, and the intelligence community was trying to change its focus to prioritize Asia and China before the terrorist attack of September 11, years before. But terrorism diverted American attention and resources, and those of the intelligence community, for 20 years. That said, uh, when I was working and after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and even after I was working, now I don't have access to data and I can't say anything classified, of course, but it's, I think, an easy thing to say, and not revealing something that I shouldn't, that the Russian intelligence services had more officers active and residing in the United States, targeting the United States and Western interests, than the CIA employed in the world. Uh, think of that. And that didn't change when the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia became what? No longer the millennial, Soviet Union trying to bring world revolution in theory. Um, so that hasn't changed. And Vladimir Putin, a rough contemporary of mine, um, was not a career. Well, he was a career uh, KGB officer. He didn't spend his entire career doing it, but that's what formed his worldview and his approach to international relations. Uh, so for the West, for the United States in particular, to uh, divert its eye and attention from Russia is an error. It's a huge error.
We'll come back to Putin
It's
because
a
I
great. It's
think,
in fact,
yeah.
it's even an existential blunder, uh, and one should be able to do more than one thing at a time. So while I agree that we need to have as our number one priority China, that doesn't mean we diminish our focus actually on Russia either.
We'll come back to Putin because that's fascinating to hear in what respects he's a classic KGB officer, and we'll come back to that. But this idea that a grave existential threat has been ignored because another threat is perceived to be greater, does this also not ignore the idea of authoritarian alignment? That actually there may be a certain amount of resource intelligence sharing, but also strategic and tactical sharing, and even a concept in China that they could use Russia to do their dirty work and leverage Russian networks, maybe as an agent of chaos to achieve its own geopolitical ends. So actually dividing the two as separate problems may be fundamentally misunderstanding the nature of the threat.
Well, I don't think we need to have a legacy of excuse me, communism or even totalitarianism for what you say to be correct. Of course, the enemy of one's enemy is one's friend, and international relations is an amoral business. So, to the extent that any nation can leverage others for its own national interests and purposes, it will do so, and certainly China is quite happy to have Russia creating headaches for the West in Central Europe as one specific example. And in any other way that they may leverage another state's interests for their own purposes, they will do so. All nations will do that, certainly. The only nations that don't, to some slight degree, and that's a little more cynically stated than I actually believe, is frankly the West and the normative system, much derided by the third world. We can no longer say third world. We have to say, what the heck do we say? Global South now we say. Um, uh, is frankly a legacy and triumph of Soviet and Marxist propaganda. The normative system is not fictitious, and it is grossly imperfect, but it is also more substantive and real from the efforts of the United States since 1945 than ever in human history. And that normative system does, except on issues of vital existential national security interests as perceived by American leaders or other leaders, that normative system does shape the behavior and constrain the behavior of regulate, let's say, the behavior of Western nations in a way that is not the case for Russia or China.
And that's interesting, isn't it? Because not only do you hear from activists and some in the media, but I've heard quite a few analysts also say that this idea of a global rule of law and the so-called international order, which we bemoan the breakdown of, or the lack of will in the West to enforce it, and a lack of understanding of what the real benefits are that it's brought, they say, well, it wasn't real anyway. You see that actually as a rather sort of clever and effective piece of sort of Russian or communist propaganda.
Absolutely. Now, that view, the cynicism about the normative system, is sincerely held by hundreds of millions of people, but that doesn't mean it's correct. You know, every most people in the world are religious, and they believe that their particular religion is the universal truth. And you know, of course, that's you know, that's not possible that every religion be the universal truth and then there be multiple religions. And so the solution, of course, is that we all go around massacring each other for our truths. No, it's simply not true. The objective data is so overwhelming that it shouldn't even need any discussion whatsoever. You compare uh, the actions of the United States from those of other hegemons in human history, and the United States has constrained itself and has allowed itself uh, to lose various arguments uh, an infinite number of times, and does play by rules that it took the primary lead in standing up and creating. Uh, but then the results are just stunning in how that system adduces to the general welfare rather than solely to the welfare of the hegemon of the United States. You look at infant mortality and women's rights and contractual respect for contracts and opportunities for non-American, non-hegemon entities, whether it's Airbus or Bata in India or Ibrahim's vegetable stand in Marrakesh to thrive in ways that have never happened in human history, and for nations to run their own affairs. I mean, this is just categorically true. And now, of course, were you a Russian counterpart of mine on the air, you would smile cynically and talk about, you know, how I am one, you'd say I'm an agent of the CIA. And so therefore, of course, one can't believe anything that I'm saying. But if I were not, if it were you speaking with the Russian, that they would say how naive you are to have believed the propaganda that you have been fed for all your entire life. When, of course, we know that nations are cynical, blah, 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 blah. Projecting to give them the best interpretation, the most kind interpretation of what they're doing possible, projecting their own hideous history onto the behavior of other states, which we all do. Of course, we all project our own cultural norms, but that is simply not the truth. Not the truth. I have this occur. This issue comes up almost literally every day for me in my post-agency career, because, as you said, I am a columnist and I appear frequently on media around the world. Less so in the United States now because my book is not fresh, and I haven't been in the agents for a while, and I was not the director of the CIA. I was just one CIA guy among a number. But the foreigners like me more because um, I hope they find me articulate, and I do offer insights from an American intelligence foreign policy perspective that are unusual to have access to. But in all of these interviews, this paradigm and these assumptions dominate, and I spend all my time essentially trying to say, well, that actually you were projecting preconceptions that are not do not correlate with the reality. But it's, if not a losing argument, an endless one, never won.
And it's ironic, isn't it? In the 90s, you had essentially an absence of rule of law, but an absence of tyranny in Russia, and various indices such as longevity collapsed as the sort of, the infrastructure of the Soviet Union collapsed. The early period of Putin's regime could be described as hybrid authoritarianism, but with strong features of a market economy. And you saw indices of personal wealth and comfort rising dramatically. You saw longevity rising dramatically. It's when Russia has turned to far more, I would say, sort of old Soviet and Tsarist imperialist sort of policies and all-out authoritarianism, you're starting to see those indices collapse again. Personal wealth, security, longevity. So Russia, in some ways, proves that the closer you get to a rule of law society, or at least to a one that has features of a market economy, it brings benefits. So they'd probably argue that that wasn't the case, but it.
Yeah, well, that you and I have to be talking about this in 2025 is just so disheartening, frankly. The answer to Marxism was given within moments of the publication of the Communist Manifesto. I mean, the flaws of Marxism, and specifically the economic model of centralizing decision making and control, are patent. There's nothing. We shouldn't even be talking about this. And as Russia liberalized and established, you put your finger on the central single point, which is the rule of law, uh, rather than the rule of men or decree. Then efficiency will go up. Uh, Stalin knew this, but he refused to give up power. So his decision was, well, better that they all starve, literally, than that I not have control, because he was a sociopath, and I think also sincere in his beliefs that the state had to control everything, and that understanding nothing about economics, that Marx must be right, and so on. But these issues have been resolved for let's see, 1848, so 179 years, if I do my math right, essentially. Except that people, the truth is irrelevant to conviction.
And again, Russia has the answer there as well, because under the period of NEP, or New Economic Policy under Lenin, where they reintroduced features of a capitalist system and features of a command economy, the economy almost reversed. The economic losses of the First World War in a very short
Instantaneous,
period. Instantaneous, huge dynamo
instantaneous.
of wealth creation.
Well, let's take the specific issue of your current focus, and the one that should be for most of us, which is Ukraine. What the communism did through collectivization to Ukraine was so grotesque that the Ukrainians were reduced in desperation to welcoming effing Nazis as liberators. I mean, what a choice! What a choice! Uh, because 30 million of them, I think it was, or no, it's 8 million Ukrainians, um, were killed from uh, communist policies.
Intentionally starved to
So
death, yes.
yeah, yeah, and
A-
intentionally so,
And of
by
course, the struggle
true
now
belief and
since
cynicism.
since 2014, the struggle actually can be characterized not as NATO encroachment, which of course again is the favorite argument of realist geopolitics politicians, analysts, and Vatniks and others, and those who have a sort of a loathing of their own Western societies. But actually, it's that struggle between a sort of command economy, highly verticalized, nepotistic, and corrupt system, which of course is the Russian system, with a massively decentralized, or elements of massive decentralization, which is Ukraine since 2014. Because we know about Maidan, but what many people don't realize is that it's a radical experiment in decentralization of power.
Well, I think that's true, but I put that actually just at a secondary. It's critical, but at a secondary level, uh, to me, the fundamental issue in Ukraine is Putin's determination, because he's a Russian nationalist and he believes in great Russia. It is the clash between Ukraine's definitive, it's clear, but this only in the last for 2025, only in the last 20 years, perhaps. You would know better than I think. Um, Turn and to the West, to Western norms, wholeheartedly to Western norms, and desire to have individual rights, rule of law, open society, to challenge authority as a basis of truth, be it at an individual level or up to the level of state power, all of which is antithetical to Russia's history. And Putin, understandably, doesn't want to see the near abroad become the West, which is Ukraine. And poor Ukraine and poor Poland, they're sort of the losers in history because they're stuck in the middle on flat land. If they were mountainous, they would have done a little better. They might have been Tito, but um, that's the clash. It's a very simple one, very simple one. And all of this, it's now FSB propaganda, but Russian conviction, sincerely, of many. Because if you hear a falsehood enough, it becomes the truth in your mind. And that's not a facetious statement. That is literally the case. We can talk about that, but
It's how religious
um,
catechisms work through endless repetition
uh,
of set
absolutely,
phrases.
whatever the norm is becomes the truth, because no one has time to, or the ability, no human does, to examine every question in human existence empirically and personally. So you accept a paradigm. So fine. Um, all of this is I've half lost my train of thought, but this is the issue at play in Ukraine, and Putin is trying to make it stop. And he realized that he had lost the game. Sounds too lighthearted, facetious. He had lost the contest, not he, Russia. The entire cultural construct and model and history had lost in Central Europe because there's nothing more powerful and desired ultimately than for an individual to make his own decisions and to go his own way, which is the Western model. And so the alternative was he either loses, reforms, and then all can win, or he opposes and destroys and holds on. And he chose, of course, the latter
And of course, it
to the
brings
point where
innovation
to the
as
point
well.
where
Yeah.
this is something which is shocking, and it's a remarkable testament to something about the Russian character or soul, if such a thing as soul exists, which is that there have been 1 million casualties in a population of 140 million. That's 70 million males, of whom probably, let's say, 40 million of them are eligible in age and conditioning and so on to serve in the military. So that's 2.5% of the relevant male population of all Russia has now been destroyed, killed or destroyed, in this effort to hold on to the ancient Russian way in Central Europe.
It is extraordinary. And of course, Putin probably doesn't have a threshold number in his mind, which he's prepared to waste. This could easily rise to 3 million
Mm-hmm.
if his economy is not sort of choked off and he's enabled to continue that aggression. That brings me on to Putin himself, because what is your impression as someone who has been through the intelligence services? And as you mentioned earlier, it was your business to understand how your counterparts in the Soviet Union, in Russia in particular, and China worked, how they thought, how they operated, and what they wanted to do to you and your colleagues in our societies. Do you see Putin as a classic KGB officer, or would he be a fairly low-level functionary, which he seemed to occupy in that ecosystem? His behavior doesn't strike me as being particularly strategic, and he doesn't seem able to change course. He only has, a couple of gears. One is escalation, and the other one is this extreme aggression. Do you see those as characteristics of a classic KGB archetype, or there are other elements there you can identify?
Well, he may have been a low-level functionary. He wasn't in his career long enough to rise up, particularly. But I don't think that's really relevant. I mean, he's clearly bright, trained, and he is Russian. He is a Russian nationalist. He's a Russian patriot. He is a KGB officer. Russian culture is, because it realizes that the law has always been a pretense or a shroud over power rather than the regulator of society and of power. So that makes him a classic Russian, highly intelligent and trained in a particular view, which I don't think is unique to the KGB. I think it's a Russian one of international relations, which is cynical, and that one morals are a fool's design. Uh, and norms are a fool's design. It's all pure exercise of power in a zero sum game, which is fundamentally different from the Western norm, which is that both sides can benefit by some sort of agreement. So I don't dismiss him or deride him or think he's unusual in viewpoints because of his background. I think he is more talented and ruthless than many, which is you don't rise to his position without having various skills, um, many of which are appalling, but that's what it requires in that system. Uh, and so that's how I see him. I don't see him as poor. I think here, let me tell one little point, which I think illustrates how he sees the world, how the intelligence service in Russia does, and how Russians can be sincerely deluded within their paradigm, as all of us are, as all of us are. So in 1983, it was during Reagan's first administration, the KGB initiated, and Reagan's talking about, I forget the exact terminology, Star Wars was an issue. We're going to, protect ourselves with this, missile defense system, and we're going to destroy the Soviet Empire. It's the evil empire, blah, blah, blah. And they initiated a large operation within the KGB to understand what was going on. It's called Operation Ryan. And the system is so twisted, so
Ryan.
perverse.
They called it Brian.
Ryan. No, R like Romeo, YAN. It's a Russian acronym. I don't speak Russian. I
No.
could look up it stands for. But Operation Ryan was to provide advance warning of when America was going to launch its first strike nuclear attack, which they believed was, if not imminent, sincerely being planned. Why did they believe this? Well, the ruling authorities were paranoid and they said, we're afraid of this. Well, okay. And so therefore the KGB, the field officer like myself, my counterparts off in Dresden, where Putin was, or wherever the hell, said they aren't going to say, well, we have no evidence of this. And so what are you talking about? Because if you do that, you end up in the gulag. And if you're great, you can write, a superb book, but more likely you will die. Um, and so they start sending in reports, which of course are filtered to pander and please the master, because if you don't please the master, then you're by definition wrong in the system, and you'll be doomed. And I say it with a laugh, but it is twisted. This is Kurt Vonnegut. You laugh at the tragedy, but meanwhile, you're being firebombed if you don't kowtow. So they started sending these reports, all of which are confirming the presupposed conclusion. But everyone believed it. And the people who didn't thought, well, okay, maybe I'm insane because everyone else, what am I missing? And this is not this is true. And so the reports went on and on and on and on, and it became this circular reporting, and the Russians were terrified that Reagan was about to launch a nuclear strike, and they actually believed this, and so they then took measures to prepare for this, which is a sensible thing to do if you're about to be bombed with nuclear weapons, which the Americans picked up, and the Americans, my counterparts and the Americans went, "Oh my God, the Soviets are taking nuclear war steps," and things sort of escalated. And this was all an absolute delusion because of a perverse system that only accepted confirmation of propaganda derived assertions. It's sick, but it is also real, although completely fictional. Completely fictional. And so this is the world in which Putin operates. And anyone who's spoken to a Russian, or frankly, you could say the same thing about an American, except our delusions tend to be more benign, unless you're an Iraqi, say. Um, uh,
Or unless you
these
consider
delusions
January the
become truth.
6th, which is, we'll come onto that in a minute, because it
Yeah.
seems our delusions are becoming
So
more
so to
toxic.
to summarize my response to your question, I don't find the fact that he was a functionary at a relatively low level significant. More significant is that he's a Russian nationalist, a Russian patriot, a trained KGB officer. His view of international relations is zero sum, and he wants to retain and extend Russian influence as any government person working for a particular government should want to do.
Is it also possible that there's an extra layer of toxicity there? Maybe you don't need it if you consider Dzerzhinsky and the culture that came out of that. But at the period where nominally he was no longer a KGB officer, although it's arguable whether anyone can ever leave that service. But it was a period where the mafia and the prison culture that had spilled out the late Soviet period and into perestroika was percolating into more and more corners of society. And then the period where I was in Russia, you had the old KGB feeling a little bit lost, it had to be said, a little starved of resources and love, but also realizing that without their nemesis, the Communist Party, they had a chance of retaking the entire country. And indeed, then you had a merger between, if you believe Felishtinsky and some others, you had a merger of the mafia prison culture with the KGB, which then essentially took over the state. Is that simplistic? And do you see characteristics of that prison culture in Putin?
Yeah, no, I don't think it's simplistic at all. I would say that it's describes the essentials of the dynamic as I understand it is, and I think that is I don't think there's any reasonable challenge to this description of events. One can't separate the Russian oligarchs, the Russian quote mafia unquote, and the Russian intelligence services. When the Soviet Union collapsed, there was not quite a state of nature, but there was chaos, and then there was privatization done, I think, very poorly. It's easy to criticize privatizing a centralized economy. It's one of the hardest things possibly to do on earth is to do it successfully without vast corruption. But whether that's true or not, there was, and so who continued to influence, if not hold, the levers of power? It was the security state, which is the KGB and the FSB and GRU and on and on. And so who took advantage of these things, but the ruthless people who were willing to kill and knew how to exercise wield power. And they're the ones I just mentioned, in addition to murderous thugs. I couldn't do it. I'm a goody two shoes who reads books and stops at traffic lights. And I would have been quickly fed to the cats. But they are ruthless killers and dynamic, talented individuals, many of them. And so there is this marriage of these overlapping sets. There's no question about that. And Putin came to the top of the heap in that, and that defines the state. You do not have oligarchs sending $100 million themselves and all of their all of their escorts to London without the okay overview of and manipulation by the Russian state and Russian intelligence service or anywhere else. Absolutely certain. I saw firsthand in 1994. I was in Geneva. I was living in Europe, and you could literally see the Russian, the new rich Russian oligarchs walking on the streets of Geneva with briefcase in one hand and the rental escort female of the moment on the other, going to the Swiss banks with their literally ill-gotten gains. And if one so much as raised an eyebrow at them, you died. And so that defines the state, yes.
Let's fast forward. So this idea is absolutely fascinating of a kind of narrative that takes hold, a paranoid narrative that takes hold, and then the system reinforces it, whether there's truth in that or not. Fast forward to now, or the last couple of years, you have two stories which are very much taken to be truth, but which have caused extraordinary partisan divides because those so-called truths have been taken very differently, whether you're from a MAGA perspective or a liberal democratic perspective. Perhaps neither are particularly sophisticated interpretations of these materials. One is the story that Trump is actually a KGB asset or SVR or whatever it happens to be by the code name of Krasnov. That story is very readily taken up by those who are opposed to Trump, and it is derided by those who are in the MAGA cult. You also have the Steele dossier. Now, most people think this is genuine, including a number of journalists I know, whereas someone like David Satter says, no, this appears as a piece of tradecraft. And if we're perhaps warranting the Russians with a little more smartness than perhaps they suggest, a very clever piece of tradecraft that creates a narrative designed to weaponize the system, designed to provoke a completely different reaction, whether you are pro or anti-Trump, and therefore it divides your enemy, it divides and conquers them by sowing this extraordinary sort of, arguments that we saw, certainly in the first Trump administration. What's your interpretation of these narratives that seem to be fed into our information and political system?
Yeah, I think they're both too simplistic and something that I think that almost everyone, and I would include even intelligence officers, but much less, um, misunderstands or misses is that all of the above can be simultaneously true and false. And I think that is the case. Um, one imagines, the average layman will imagine, okay, one's a spy, one's not a spy. But that's not really how it works. Sometimes it does. Sometimes I could say, uh, Mr. Fink, will you spy for the United States? And you say, oh, yes. And I say, okay, well, sign right here. And now you're a spy. Okay, that happens. Uh, More often, all of us are contradictory, and all of us operate at multiple levels of conviction and sincerity with respect to the infinite number of issues to which we react in our lives. And so I can simultaneously be an American patriot and work to undermine my country. I can believe, choose whatever else you want to believe in. I can believe in God and think that it's all nonsense simultaneously. We are not coherent, consistent, uniform beings. And that's how intelligence works. So The Russians are superb at this. I think they're superior to the Americans and even the British. I think the British are more devious in some ways than the Americans. Um, in that you can say, "Oh, Glenn, here's what I want you to do, and here's why, and here's how it will help you." And I'll go, "Oh yeah, okay, fine." And at the same time, maybe they will. At the same time, they will be taking steps to destroy me, at least potentially. Have the lever ready to turn the switch to destroy me. Although I'm working sincerely for them, or they will in, initiate operations or disinformation or actions that will counter exactly what they're having me do. So, an example is the Russians have simultaneously uh, fostered uh, social tensions with regard to race relations in the United States. At the same time that they are supporting um, white supremacists and black civil rights leaders. Well, that doesn't make any sense. Of course, it makes perfect sense because the point is not to advance black rights or white supremacy. The point is to put people at odds with each other, to make them not understand what's happening, for them to feel tension, distrust, grievance, and to be potentially more manipulable, whatever the word is, and then you have achieved your objective. And you do that with an individual too, such as Donald Trump, or Glenn Carle. It doesn't matter. Uh, you will exploit them for certain purposes and undermine them for others simultaneously. Now, someone I was expecting you to mention, because you touched upon, I think this is your work, if not your life's work, certainly important to it. I think one of the um, overlooked significant figures in the 21st century, if not beyond that, is Vladimir Putin's former vice premier, whatever his title was. Vladimir, I think is his first name, Surkov,
Surkov, I was about
who
to say. Vladislav Surkov, yeah.
Vladislav Surkov, who to me is the architect of what is destroying the world. Actually, I mean, he's a seminal genius, unfortunately.
Yes. Yes, I've actually asked
In
some Ukrainian journalists to investigate because he's nominally retired. He's sort of nominally fell out of favor
right.
after the invasion of Crimea, which of course he was the one of the instigators of. I rather suspect that he hasn't gone into retirement, but decided to take a slightly lower profile. I'm fascinated
And
to hear
he's
what you think.
unanimous grise, or what his function is actually, I think, now irrelevant because his approach has been so profoundly incorporated into the foreign policy and the intelligence policy and the governmental policy and the specific paradigm and approach of Vladimir Putin, that whether he's alive or dead is now secondary. Marx is dead, but Marx defines still a lot, and the same with Surkov. And for people who few people will even know who this man is, but he essentially um, took marketing techniques and propaganda techniques, which are as old as time, um,
And postmodern
and distilled them.
theatre. We don't forget postmodern theatre, which is a big influence as well.
I have railed against postmodernism for all my adult life. You're touching a sensitive button here with me. Um, there is truth. Our senses do perceive objective reality, and to destroy it because saying everything is relative and only comes out of our own heads will turn us into nihilists or Vladimir Putin. Um, but okay, we'll put philosophy and sociology aside for just a moment, a little. But Surkov's objective is to so distort people's perceptions that truth becomes impossible to identify. That sounds ludicrous, but I'm completely serious. And that empowers the state because then, and I mentioned this point earlier, it has been empirically shown that a statement repeated sufficiently becomes one's perceived reality, therefore the truth. And that allows the state to say, well, even though, let's say, Ukrainians are starving because of collectivization, I can say, we're all marching towards a happier future. Look, the sun is rising. And if you repeat this endlessly, many people will believe it until the moment they expire from starvation. And I'm not being, I'm exaggerating a bit for effect, but not fundamentally. And taking that sounds, well, what does that have to do with international relations? What it has to do with is the projection of Russian state power in this instance. And who is the great opponent? That's the United States. How does one go after, challenge the United States? Well, you can try to build MiG fighter jets that are the equal of F-22s, but better is to undermine the foundations of American coherency and power. And that is social cohesion, belief in democracy, belief in the rule of law, faith in institutions, and you undermine that by supporting white nationalists and civil rights activists simultaneously, and having individuals say things that are at cross purposes to reality. And then you end up with the America of today.
A lot cheaper
And
as well.
that's an explicit, that is the explicit uh, strategy of Russian intelligence services, the Russian government, and has been. The Russians are the best at this and have been since the Soviet Revolution and even before, because the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the greatest disinformation campaign in history, was the Russian intelligence service that wrote it. Um, so they're just wonderful at doing this,
Mm.
but this has been distilled and modernized by Vladislav Surkov into a state policy. And over 25 years, and the Russians are better at long-term projects than the Americans. This has reaped, we are now reaping dramatic success and consequences from this sustained uh, operation understates strategy.
Mm. And if people want to learn more, I mean, there's two ways to do that. I think there's a few interviews of his out there. They're not that numerous, but they can read a book called The Magician of the Kremlin. The author, I don't recall the name of the author, but it is a fabulous book, and it part fiction. I think a lot of it is non-fictional actually, and it takes all of his pronouncements, all of his interviews, all of the intimations of what you've been talking about, and it puts it into a semi-fictionalized book, which is incredibly readable. Surkov has also written a novel, which very few people will have read, but it's called Okolo Nulla, or Around the Zero, or Around the Nothing, and it's an extraordinary, absurd piece of postmodern political satire. I strongly recommend people. And there are many people in the pro-Ukraine community who are doing these videos about geopolitics. And I did a bit of a straw poll, and very few people of them had heard of Surkov, despite the fact he's the architect of the chaos that they're reporting on every day. So I'm glad you brought that up. Talking of this chaos as well, I mean, when people talk about the CIA, they often think of a toolkit of methodologies to disrupt various regimes, topple regimes, and all this kind of interventionist stuff. However, if we switch that round, the Soviets are good at this stuff. How far do we see the development of an authoritarian toolkit, a set of methodologies for eroding democracy, rule of law? One could mention countries like Serbia, Hungary, Slovakia, Georgia, and many others. How far do you see it as a sort of formalized toolkit, and what features of this authoritarian toolkit for state capture do you actually see on display in the US? Now, it's not to say that Russia's behind it, but once a toolkit is developed, anybody who has authoritarian inclinations can utilize those methodologies with or without Russian support. Do you see that kind of process unfolding in the US?
Without question, absolutely. I tried to just say that it is occurring. But let's use, like all American intelligence officers, I was focused uh, on terrorism for many years. That became my thing more than the Russians. I became a terrorist person. But let's take some terminology from our good friend Osama bin Laden, or actually it was one of his mentors, but no matter. And so the United States is the head of the snake, or the great Satan, or both. But there are little Satans, and there are other snakes, or the body of the snake. So the number one target is the United States, but it's not the only target at all. Not at all. No, Europe is directly has been targeted for decades in the same ways, in absolutely the same ways. Now, this extends or encompasses the kind of operation that people would understand if they heard of it, such as at minimum 2 attempts by the Russian intelligence services to assassinate the prime minister of Montenegro, 2 the Russian operations, conceivably Ukrainian, but I really believe it's Russian, to severing cables in the North Sea, to any number of quote think tanks and forums, if we want to use the bastardized contemporary English, in France, which is my specialty. I know I lived in France for many years and studied in French schools and so on. So that's where my attention tends to default. But that's the only reason France I single out, because it's equally true for Great Britain or for Germany, et cetera, where these think tanks are friendship societies or international affairs study groups or journalists associations, all of which get together and present viewpoints that don't directly contradict the United States, but that raise concerns. Well, isn't it unfair? That's even too strong a term. Wouldn't it be good were France to have a national defense independent of that of the hegemon? And I put that in actually crude terms compared to how they do it. They're much more sophisticated than that. Um, and so then one thinks, well, of course, I love France or I love Germany, and so why should Washington, when these people who are overweight and eat bad food, tell me what to do? Uh, well, sure. And all of a sudden, then the threads that bind Europe to the United States start to loosen a little bit, and this is a long-term project, and that's happening all over the place, from literal assassinations to the level of shaping acceptable discourse or raising different points of view. And of course, one must have different points of view, but if they're directed towards undermining, that's a different story, and that's the stuff of the essence of the Russian strategy. Now, the intelligence services methods are those are tactics, but the strategy is absolutely clear.
And how far do you see that working its way through in, say, the activities of Doge, which could be described as a wholesale smash and grab on the private data of US citizens for ends which are not exactly clear at this point? You've got USAID, which is basically eviscerating soft power, soft foreign policy power. You've got the politicization and again, the hollowing out of the intelligence services. You've got potentially the politicization of the military. How far are these processes that come from a political partisan view of the world or a conscious attempt to degrade in real time US hard and soft power and influence in the world? I mean, an intentional deconstruction of a superpower.
Well, the ultimate strategic objective is the deconstruction of a superpower. As I said, that's absolutely true. It's not true. So it is true that the Russians, say my counterpart, would say, "Oh, what a good idea it would be to support and isolationists in the United States, for example, or little government advocates." That that adduces to Russian national, helps Russian national interests. But the people who are isolationists or little government conservatives are completely sincere and are completely patriotic, and this is how one can objectively be a tool of Russian intelligence in this instance, and yet a totally sincere patriot at the same time, who is hostile to Russia and loves America. Um, so that is true. But it's also true and important, and I think the driving force is that the Doge element or effort that you cited as our specific example right now is a sincere effort, and that comes from a whole different uh, couple of strains of political philosophy and political culture in the United States and in the West. And that is one that there have always been small government conservatives. That's fine, or people who want to deregulate. But the this movement is not originated by the Russians, although exploited by. Of course, you exploit anything you can exploit. One of my classmates in college at Harvard 50 years ago, not a friend, but we were both government majors. Or we were reading government, which one in other American universities is called political science. Has devoted his life, and he's one of the unknown, just like Vladislav Surkov. This is one of the unknown powers or influencers of our lifetimes, named Grover Norquist, and his objective, and not only his, but he's been central to it. He's devoted his life to changing the American government in two ways. One, he thinks that government only, the national government of the United States only has two functions, literally two: national defense, that means the military, and border control. That's it. And otherwise, his objective is to reduce the size in absolute terms of personnel and budget of the central government, the federal government of the United States, by 50%. That's the basis of the now dominant wing of the Republican Party that leads to that gives us Doge. The other is Project 2025, which is the current incarnation of the second strain, and that is the conviction that the American government is inefficient, and it is by design, by intent, inefficient. The explicit decision being that it is better to be inefficient, to separate powers rather than allow them to concentrate, because that can lead to tyranny. Um, Now, you can say, I think it's pretty clear that a separation of powers, decentralized federal system, in many ways is less efficient than the CCP of Beijing, or the thug state of Vladimir Putin. They don't have to worry about the law; they can simply seize land and direct resources as they wish. And that leads to many efficiencies and advantages. It also leads to structural disadvantages and so on. But okay, so the feeling is it's inefficient. Yet America is the great power on earth, and we are not designed to effect a foreign policy in any coherent, effective, sustained way that can perennialize American hegemony and maximize American strength. We must do something about this. And so let's centralize power. And this is called the unitary theory of executive power, which is we have to stop essentially all of this separation of powers, the three co-equal branches of government and so on, bring it all together in the executive so that he can act. And that's quite coherent. And maybe it's correct, but it is also literally revolutionary in American terms. So if Americans decide they want to have that system of government, I will oppose it. But if that's how the process evolves, so that that becomes the government, that okay, that's a coherent, rational decision and one that can be in conformity with the rule of law and the Constitution. But that's not how it's playing out, of course. So the effort is to centralize power. Now, where does that theory come from? I love saying this because it sounds so outlandish and no one believes it, but it's literally true. The the philosopher of this unitary theory of executive power, just like we look to Marx and Lenin and Mao as the fathers of communism,
Not Steve
is a
Bannon, is
man
it,
named
or Roger Stone? Or they're
no,
just
no, no, no. Steve
adherents to
Bannon
it.
is a
Yeah.
disciple. Steve Bannon is a disciple. It's a man named Carl Schmitt, who was an eminent jurist. And where is he an eminent jurist? He was Adolf Hitler's personal lawyer. And he was a highly respected and well regarded, brilliant lawyer and thinker in then still Weimar Germany. although he was one of the masters of its destruction. And he justified Kristallnacht. He was the one who wrote the brief for Kristallnacht, and on and on and on. And you can say, well, the fact that he did that doesn't undermine the coherency and the necessity and the rightness of his philosophy on governmental structures. Well, possibly. I personally would be wary of basing the American system of government on one of the chief thinkers of Nazism, but that's where it comes from. So those are the two threads that are independent of the Russian intelligence operations, but that the Russians are happy to support because both not so much the Carl Schmitt centralizing of power, they wouldn't like that so much, but those are separate, profound and critical strains in what's happening in America and frankly in the West. And that at the same time, it's not only America that's going insane. Um, and why is that? That's a whole other subject that gets us back to the roots of Vladimir Putin's thought, which is frankly traditionalism, which is this change destabilizes, rise of individual rights, ergo of democratic norms, be it at an individual or societal, governmental level, undermine authority and power and what is right, as in with a capital R, I guess. And all of this is to be opposed. This is what Dostoevsky writes about. And this is the soul of Russia, to oppose the perverse West and modernism. And it's profoundly laced into the deep conservative movements throughout Europe and the United States. The French right bases itself upon a thinker named René Guénon. He's a traditionalist. He derives his basis of his thought in his opposition to the West. Islamic jihadists are the same. In fact, the far right in Europe has profound associations with jihadist Islam because both of them reject Western norms, which are decadent, that dismiss Allah or God or the church or the Kremlin, or the way things used to be in America before America got it wrong. And all of them are deeply associated. When I talk about this, people think that I'm some sort of a loon, because how can you bring Osama bin Laden, Vladimir Putin, and Donald Trump together coherently? But they
No, no.
are.
Well, the Ukrainian journalist Vitaly Portnikov refers to Russia as Hezbollah of the snow. So this
Ah,
is
well,
the
there we go.
thought that's
A man
occurred
after
to
my
other
own heart.
people. Yes, and of course, people
I
will,
have to meet him. This is great.
Russophiles will, and many who are sucked into the great Russian culture will, endlessly bang on about Dostoevsky and The Idiot, which is quite a humane novel out of his oeuvre. They won't really talk about Zapiski is Podpolya, the underground man, which is the person who rebels against rationality for no other reason other than he can and to his own personal detriment. And one which no one reads, which is called Zimnie Zapiski na letних впечатлениях, which is winter notes on summer impressions when he visited London. You can imagine Victorian London with the Great Exhibition and these huge advancements of technology and a lot of the suburbs recently built, shiny brick streets, etc. He was both awed and horrified by this industrial mechanism. And again, I think what you've said there, his reaction was, one, we cannot copy this, two, we have to tear it down. This cannot stand.
Absolutely. This is what essentially this is the dilemma for any culture, but we're talking about Russian culture, and I touched upon Islam. Any culture that is confronted by a more dynamic, more powerful culture. The choice is I evolve and I embrace, or I oppose. If I reform and embrace, then I no longer am who I am. And because by definition, I have the truth, the great Russian soul. We are here on earth as the purity of God's will and national purpose and essence of being. And so, if we don't remain true to that, we are betraying who we are and the whole point of existence.
And you
Um,
deconstruct
so
your
that means,
economic model. You have to deconstruct
yeah,
your vertical of power, which controls resources, and your story is built to justify your
that's right.
control yeah.
And your soul. It's a betrayal of everything that has made you what you are. And who wants to be a traitor and lose what they are? So the alternative is you oppose. Now, where we this plays out in every cultural clash between the more dynamic society and the more traditional one, thus traditionalism, in human history. What's the story of the American Indian? Now, it's contemporarily obligatory to say that, of course, their society was as pure at the very least as the West, this rapacious West and so on. And there's truth to that, of course. But the fact is that a bow and arrow is less lethal than gunpowder, and thus, they were doomed. That's it. And they had a choice. If we embrace the more powerful society, we are destroyed. If we oppose them, we will be destroyed. Better to oppose them and remain who we are than to surrender and lose our essence before we lose our existence. It's the same story with regard to Islam. It's the same story, and it has been for at least 500 years with regard to Russia. Russia is a hybrid because it, you know, partially embraced and partially resisted, but ultimately, they want to define themselves as not the West. And so there's sort of this fatal doom culturally in their perspective that we must either destroy or be destroyed.
And again, they have an inferiority complex at the same time, which means that they must acquire the superficial features of those societies they envy while creating a narrative that actually they loathe the societies that gave rise to those things they prized, the luxuries, the technology, the
Oh,
machinery.
absolutely. Well, I don't know if you know the name Von Meter. It turns out Von Meter, he was a comedian during President Kennedy's administration. So this is now 60 years ago. He happened to be recently learned from my hometown, which is Brookline, Massachusetts. My father actually knew the Kennedys as a little boy, which are other stories. So that's why this comedian could do the Kennedy accent so well, because it was his own accent. And in his most famous recording at the time, it was a national bestseller in 1962. He told a joke, and President Kennedy was meeting with Premier Khrushchev and Charles de Gaulle for some summit, and they take a break. It's lunchtime, and so Kennedy's the host. So of course, as an American, they order sandwiches instead of some sort of a state dinner. And Kennedy says, "I'll simplify a little bit." Kennedy says, "Well, I'll have a Western sandwich," and I don't know if a Western sandwich is known in England or elsewhere. A Western sandwich is a kind of sandwich. I don't even know what's in it, but it has lettuce and tomato. Who knows what? It's a kind of sandwich, like a bologna sandwich or something. So Kennedy says, I will have a Western sandwich. I could even do the accent, but I won't. And so Khrushchev listens to this and he says, well, then I will have the Eastern half of the Western sandwich. You know, well, that's it. There, humor distills truth, and that's the Russian resentment and inferiority.
And of course, the French guy will not want a sandwich at all. They'll want
Or he
something
wouldn't have that.
utterly
I
different.
forget
Yeah,
what I have to listen to it now because, of course, they got a De Gaulle too, and
yeah.
I'm certain he was condescending and very haughty about this crude American, trash.
Yes. I mean, the last area, of course, and probably the one which did cause some controversy, as you'd expect, is our assessment of what are Trump's motivations. Yes, you've got influences which can be described as maybe sort of native ideological ones, not necessarily entirely manufactured by Russia. But you also have sort of curious indications from his history of having imbibed considerable amounts of Russian investment into various businesses, being saved from bankruptcy at certain points is the implication. And also you have the rather curious adverts that he took out shortly after visiting Moscow, where he
That's right.
denounced NATO. All his actions are potentially could be interpreted as to the benefit of Russia, including his Ukraine policy, broadly speaking. And of course, many jump to the conclusion, therefore, that he's a Russian asset. Is that perhaps a red herring? If he's acting to the benefit of Russia, does it matter whether he's an agent, asset, or whatever definition we put on it?
Absolutely, that's the critical point. I'm glad you said it. And we are two tines of a tuning fork. It's irrelevant whether he is actually a direct Russian asset, or if he's a fellow traveler, or simply an individual being manipulated. And certainly the latter is the case. The former two definitions, I think, have been in various degrees. But I go back to my one of the early points I made. One should not think of a an intelligence operative, an asset, as American CIA officers call them, or a spy, as the layman would say, in a binary way. Uh, I I won't talk about my operations, but I can characterize a little of the nature of the work, which is that you take what you can get and you use what is useful, and then ignore the rest. And you realize that you can't have everything, and someone will work at cross purposes to your objectives and national interests many times. But if you can get them to do something, then that is a success. And it needn't be sign on the dotted line, yes, I will be a pure spy and only do things in the benefit of, in this instance, Russia. So, and anyone in a public role, well, not even a public role, cannot act in a way that is so alerting that they say, well, oh my God, this person has to be a Russian spy, because the person is anything from a CIA officer to a congressperson to a president. And so that's pretty alarming. So you do things that aren't alarming. And often, and besides, you are a patriot and you love your country anyway, even if you're spying against it. This is something that one has to understand. And so I will do things that I think are good for my country. At the same time, my other hand is out receiving, X dollars a month so that I do things that I'm requested to do by a foreign intelligence service. So all of the above, and yes, the fundamental point you make is that it's a red herring to worry too much about definitions. I've often thought, well, what's the greatest of anything? There's no greatest of anything. There's so many, who's the most beautiful woman in the world? I mean, what a stupid thing. There are an infinite number of beautiful women in the world. There are an infinite number of remarkable intelligence operations. However, the British intelligence service, to me, had one of the great successes in intelligence history in let's say from 1933, certainly from 36 to December 7, 1941, in manipulating the American political system to support Great Britain and to enter the war, to the point that there's strong evidence that no one ever talks about, that the British intelligence service selected the Republican candidate for president in 1940 so that he would be in support of America supporting Great Britain and entering the war, and destroying anyone who thought that England was a rapacious imperial nation, and so much the better that they get it taken to them, because they're all imperialist rats. And those people, the British brilliantly destroyed over and over and over and over again. About 50, do you think in miles or kilometers? No matter. 15 kilometers, 10 miles from my house here, that direction, was a radio station. I forget the call signs, in the 1930s and 1940s. That was a British intelligence operation. It was an American station broadcasting to the United States, but also with the power of a signal, broadcasting even overseas. And the thing was a pure product of British intelligence. That's just one example of an infinite number. So, of course, this all these levels of manipulation that can seem contradictory and incoherent uh, can be part of a larger strategic operation, and that's certainly what the Russians have been doing for decades.
I take a certain amount of devious pride in that story that you've just told there. That's fantastic. And then it
It's an
transitions
absolutely
through to one
brilliant
more.
operation.
It transitions through to
Absolutely
World War
brilliant
II,
operation.
where we're also inventive with Peter Pomerantsev recently with his book How to Win Information War, talking about the operations of Sefton Delmer using German actors, ones who'd fled, especially the more sort of ones into burlesque and all these slightly edgy, risky things in Weimar Germany, then turned that around and used that to inject black ops, black propaganda into
Oh,
the
well,
German system.
I'll give another. I have to give another example. So the British wanted the United States to enter the war, and how you have to have the president needs support, and the President Roosevelt wanted, as is well known, he was far more forward leaning, and to use an expression, than the American public. And so some of the things he was aware of and thought, well, good, because it helps me. Even if he knew that it was British manipulation and disinformation, and other things he didn't know about. So one of the big issues in 1940 was, oh my God, the Nazis are going to seize the Panama Canal, or the Japanese are going to seize the Panama Canal, and this will be catastrophic for American interests. And what about the Monroe Doctrine? And this is terrible. We can't possibly allow this to happen. These German operatives are everywhere, and we have to do something about it. And so the FBI is sent down to Latin America and does a lot of good things. Um, and then President Roosevelt himself gave a press conference, and he showed a famous map of here's where we have found the German operations in Panama and Colombia, and they've some of which was true, some of which was true. But the map, all of this was an explicit British intelligence operation to convince Roosevelt and the American public that the Nazis had to be opposed because it harmed American interests and not just, this besieged imperial, dying, island someplace. And Roosevelt never knew that this was the British intelligence service who ginned the entire thing up,
That's nice.
the
That's what
whole
the
thing.
Russians refer to us. The propagandists often refer to us as the main bastards. But I only wish we lived up to that history now. We do not seem to be really engaging in black informational ops with Russia. We could be doing so much more to destabilize their regime. We seem not to be doing that in Russia or Belarus.
Well,
I don't know
yeah,
if you see a
I
role for
don't
that.
know, but there should be, yes, I would argue, but that's destabilization, covert action operations are profoundly sensitive and problematic, and almost without exception, they have unintended consequences that are harmful to the country that does them. Not always, but almost always. What has alarmed me is, and I can't prove this, and I've been out of the service for years, and even if I had uh, classified information, of course, I couldn't share it. But um, I believe that the Russian intelligence service has assassinated something like 49 individuals in Great Britain in the last 20 years. Yeah, I think the numbers will have gone up. And the uh, amount of oligarch money is not definitive for the city, for London's financial center, but deeply influential on the British political system and policies. And it appears that the money is so helpful. This is a terrible thing to say, that or the service is so daunting, as in Russian service, that the British have, in a number of ways, turned a blind eye for decades to this situation, which I find shocking because the British are as courageous as anyone, at least, and their intelligence service is superb. Um, with many flaws, but that's life. That's human nature. Uh, so I have been mystified at the seeming passivity for decades. That's not as true for the United States, but that the United States has been manipulated and so on. Of course, that's certainly true. Um, but that's a shock to me.
And hopefully, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine has been a turning point, at least in trying to tackle some of that and get more involved. I believe the British are, in a kinetic way, far more involved in Ukraine. Again, without giving details away. The very last question. Trump, do you see him as moving down a sort of authoritarian win-lose zero-sum game, kind of how would you call it? Sort of, mindset or system, or does he still operate within win-win and the worst it's going to get is a sort of quasi-authoritarianism?
Well, at least quasi-authoritarianism, we're seeing that already, certainly. The polls have shown for years and years that 40% of the American public um, considers democracy irrelevant and prefers to have, quote, efficiency and someone who can get things done, and authoritarian. Uh, America's a profoundly democratic society. This is the frustration for Europeans: is how can such a disorganized cacophony make any sense or have any pretense to leadership when you don't dress right, you don't eat right, and you contradict authority figures and don't know what you're talking about. All of which is true, but all of which is the essence of the American genius and success simultaneously. Totalitarians have, for 250 years, underestimated democracies because they seem incoherent. And yet they can marshal, when they manage to, a greater force than an authoritarian state. That's been true up until now. We'll see if that's true with regard to China. So Trump, of course, that's his base, and himself is all of the things we've been talking about are not just irrelevant, they're beyond his conceptual framework or interests. It's all irrelevant. It's all, life is zero sum, life is about power, and life is about him. um, he loves his country because that's where the country he's from. So he likes wrestling and Madison Square Garden and baseball, and he's an American. So he will try to do things that he thinks are good for America. But what's good for America is what makes him think that he's uh, received praise or is the center of attention or makes the decisions. He has the power. That's the man. And so that is profoundly, that's almost the archetype of a totalitarian. It's the archetype. That's what it is. That's who he is. So separation of powers, rule of law. If the rule of law is in the way, then it's in the way. Laws are good if they support what I want to do. That's the man. So I've been saying, and the man has met the moment, or the moment has found the man, because these impulses and perceptions and desires and resentments have been surging for decades prior to his rise to actual national power. Um, so I've said for a decade, this is literally true, and pardon me for a moment of self-praise and self-quoting, which we should never do, um, that the United States faces the greatest crisis to our culture, society, and institutions, to our democracy, since at least 1861, when most will know the American Union split in two, and we had a hideous civil war for 4 years. And I argue, actually, the greatest crisis in our history. Why? Because even during our Civil War, the government and its norms, its ideals, were largely supported. And the point of the war was for half of them to uh, affirm them. And now all of those norms and structures are being rejected by a significant portion, rejected and even explicitly, simply um, viscerally, uh, out of grievance, resentment, and hope, in a way that undermines the fabric of what has been America structurally and culturally. So I'm profoundly I wake up sick to my stomach, literally.
There's so much more to follow up on here. We're sort of out of time on this conversation at least, but I feel we could go in all sorts of directions, hopefully in a future conversation if you'd be up for it. Today, though, Glenn, thank you so much for coming onto the channel.
Thank you for having me anytime. This is all important stuff.